Instagram community. It is Jules from Tarot Adventures with Jules. I have a very special treat for this live today. I will be speaking with the incredibly talented author Cat Rector, who has written The Goddess of Nothing at All, Epilogue for Lost Gods, Threads of Fate, and the soon-to-be released and utterly fabulous This Too Shall Burn. So I am just waiting for Kat to hop on, and then we will start our chat. I have also been hosting a giveaway this week of Kat's collection of all 4 of her books. They are absolutely fabulous, so I will be setting up the giveaway and letting everyone know who the winner is. I have my computer all set up here, so I'm just going good to go. Yay! Oh, I'm so excited. Hi, Kat!
Hi!
Thank you so much for joining me. I am so excited to talk about your fabulous books. Oh my goodness, I just gave everyone a small intro to the titles, and oh my gosh, okay, so yeah, I can't wait to talk about this with you. The first book that we're going to start chatting about is The Goddess of Nothing at All. Oh yeah, my lovely ring light there. There we go. Which is the first book in the series and is currently live on Kickstarter. There's an audiobook version that is funding, which is super exciting. And there's also a signed bookmarks package, which is amazing, and an ebook package that you can do as an add-on to the campaign. So yeah, let's talk about The Goddess of Nothing at All. Where did the idea for the book come from? I'm so curious.
I had kind of been having a low year. I was between jobs, living overseas, and there was not like a lot of community, and I ended up sinking myself into Norse mythology, and the more that I read, the more that I couldn't find the answers that I was looking for. There's a lot of source material that we have that's not very thorough. The ancient, like the weren't writing things down in the way that like the Greeks were, so we have this huge gap of knowledge as stories were being told around campfires and stuff, and when they were not allowed to tell those stories anymore, they disappeared. And so I was looking for all these answers and I wasn't finding them, and at some point I just was like, I'm going to write my own. And it wasn't supposed to be a serious project. It was supposed to just kill some time. And 2 years in, I was like, oh no, this is a serious project for me.
Oh my gosh, I love that so much. That's amazing. And I adore that the story is centered on Sigyn, because she is such a minor character when you look at Norse mythology. Like when you look at the original myths, she's just kind of this side character, you know, Loki's doting wife who sits with him while he's got all of his acid pouring down his face, you know, but she's so often dismissed as like a side character or someone who's not as significant. And I love that you have centered her in this book. So were you aware when you first started the project that that's who you wanted to center, and like what were your reasons behind that, and how did all of that come together?
The less cool answer is that earlier than all of this, I had been one of those Marvel Loki girls. And so I was just like, well, I would like to do something, like if I'm going to look for answers, most of the things in the book that intrigued me were surrounding Loki and Loki's family. And a lot of stories that, like, if you kind of look at it from one side or the other, it becomes a different moral quandary. And I had wanted to do something in there, but I knew I didn't want to do the same thing as everyone else. And I just was like, well, who else here needs a voice? And the more that I dug into like queer spiritual spaces where they were talking about Loki and Sigyn, there was a large number of people on one side that found that those were their deities and they respected them a lot, and then on the other side were the people had no respect for them at all, because Loki's kind of pitched as like the Christian, or like the devil, and there's a lot of information, very new information around that. But I was tired of seeing Sigyn as either a child bride, because I was like, I don't know, I just figured probably they didn't hate each other. That would suck to be in a relationship where you hated each other.
Yeah. It's so much more interesting if you look at it as what if they loved each other. And I mean, Loki does a lot of shitty things, admittedly, and he's a very morally gray, morally ambiguous character, which makes them all the more fascinating, right? And his gender fluidity and his sexuality and all of that. And I loved how he was presented fully as himself, themselves, herself throughout the book. And Loki is no less morally ambiguous and morally gray, and yet the reasons for that come through in the story in a really beautiful way, looking at the relationship that Loki has with Odin and how that impacts how Loki shows up in the world, right? And yeah, I love that so much. So the character of Loki, like what kind of research did you do looking into Loki and how their character shows up and yeah, because one of the things that I love about this book is that all of the myths, the Norse mythology, is interspersed into the story and the timeline of Loki's relationship with Sigyn. And it's done in such a beautiful way that for someone who's studied Norse mythology, you get those reference points, or even someone new to Norse mythology completely would get that reference. So yeah, what was your process of unpacking how Loki was going to show up in the book?
I had a few things that were really the first was showing kind of like I wanted to take that viewpoint of like everyone is the hero of their own story. So if we can, they are the heroes of their stories, then their enemies are the other gods, and what were they doing and the reasons they were doing it that they could justify. So like that coming from their perspective was important. As well, I was seeing a lot of stuff in my research that because there's kind of this question, all of the source material that we have is from after Christianity came in, and significantly after, so we don't particularly know what has been colored by the Christian faith hundreds of years afterwards, and if Loki was positioned as kind of a devil figure before or after culture came in. And so along with that comes all of these queer behaviors. And it was really obvious to me that this character was not like a cishet man, to put it that way. And so like these two different things were really important to me with Loki's character of like, there are certain parts of the myths that I was like, I thought if that were me, I would absolutely also end the 9 realms. Like, done, no question about it. Like, if someone came after my kids, I would also end lives. Like, so that's kind of like the two main intersections for Loki that was important to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that, like, it doesn't excuse what Loki does, but it does inform it, right? Like, the situation where Idun is kidnapped, and the reasons behind that, it's not just Loki being malicious. There's a reason for him to do what he does. It doesn't justify it, and it doesn't excuse it, and it doesn't make up for what Idun ends up experiencing. But you get why he makes the choice that he does, right? It's in protection of his family. And yeah, I love that. I love that the characters in your books are allowed to be who they are fully and completely, and there's reasons behind it, and there's the story that comes through in threads through the 2 books in this series and through Threads of Fate as well, that makes you understand the decisions that the characters make, and it's more well fleshed out, which is so lovely. Yeah, I love that so much. And I love how their families are woven in too. Like Loki and Sigyn, they have Vali and they have Narvi, and then there's also Sleipnir, and the relationship between the children is so powerful, and the impact that that experience has on Loki too, of having this, giving birth to this horse, right? And then how you weave in Angrboda and Hel and Fenrir and Jormungandr. Am I saying that correctly? Their serpent child. I'm always worried about mispronouncing everything. Like, I just love the themes of found family that you have, and how those two families blend together. And I mean, I'm struggling not to give away details of the plot while also talking about it, because there's so many things that are, you know, and the book is difficult on a lot of levels, right? There's a lot of really hard things that happen, and you don't shy away from it. But I found, I don't know, like getting out of the pandemic and everything, I've really been focusing more towards like cheerful things to help me lift out of looking at the news and all of the horrific things that are happening around the world. And there are definitely heavy topics, and I really appreciated your trigger warnings that are at the beginning of the book, because it prepares you for some of the more difficult topics. But I'm rambling here, but what I mean to say is I love that there's moments of celebration and joy and connection that are woven in that help balance it all out, right? Like, it's not so heavy that there aren't these moments of joy and moments of levity and moments of honest connection, right? Because as much as Loki has had an incredibly difficult experience that's led to Loki being Loki, Sigyn has also had these incredible challenges, and there's this through line of her wanting to be an established goddess and find her place in Asgard, and really struggling with that. And so, yeah, but the way that they find each other and support each other and everything, like, it's so beautifully fleshed out, and I really appreciated that that's how you wrote them as characters. Yeah, so I know that, like, Loki has multiple wives, but Sigyn and Angrboda. So I know that there's a bunch of different takes on his relationship with both of them, and their relationships. And so how did you approach structuring that? Because there's children that are happening at the same time and interweaving everything, and some of it's related to Norse mythology. So yeah, what was your approach with that, with figuring out how all of that was going to work?
I mean, that was a bit more difficult, because there are certain ways that you could, at different points of, you know, had this whole other family. And I wanted a dynamic where Sigyn was either going to be in a consensual situation, or that it wasn't going to be something that was a 100% betrayal. Like, it's hard to say that, because of course there is betrayal around that, and I also didn't want it to be something that was like an intentional slight.
Yeah.
It is what I'm talking about, because it's so hard to allude to. But there were different things I know I didn't want when I was putting it in.
Yeah.
I have since wondered what my book would have been like if I took like a different approach. Like, there are some amazing visual artists out there who are doing like poly-family situations with both of the like with Sigyn and Angrboda and Loki, and I think that is amazing. I love their and I want to see that book too. Like, I need that book to happen.
Absolutely.
And as well, I think that into my head at the time that I was writing the first book, because I was still growing into my own queer identity and queer experience, and it really wasn't something that I either had the information to tackle well, or that I was like prepared to do as a very baby queer.
Yes, absolutely. And it's amazing how, I mean, I'm unpacking a lot of that for myself, and I have been over the last few years, and it's amazing to look at, you know, where I'm at now and what I might write now, as opposed to what I would have written 2 years ago, based on my own understanding of myself, of the world around me, of what it means to show up as a queer person, all of those things, right? So it's fascinating to look at, and I think the editing process too would be difficult, because I think we've had conversations about this, like the difficulty of finally being done with something, and like feeling the need to go back and edit and change and adjust and modify, right? And there's something to be said for letting something be what it is at that point in your life, right? And also the challenge of constantly seeing things from new angles and perspectives, right? It was so interesting. There was a comment here, and I wanted to second it. The moment when Loki shares a feeling of being prayed to with Sigyn was so beautiful. Yeah, that was one of my favorite moments in the book, where the gods are receiving the adulation of the people that worship them, and just the dialogue and the experience of Loki receiving all of this feedback from people. I mean, Loki is the patron saint of queers and runaways and everyone who lives kind of on the fringes of society, right? And it's so amazing that Loki exists as this point of prayer to let people know that they're not alone and that their identity is valid. And just the way that you articulated that and how Loki shares that with Sigyn was so beautiful. It was such an affirmation of you deserve to exist, you deserve to show up in the world, and that was so beautiful. Yeah, that's more of a comment, not a question. But I just really appreciated how you wrote that in. Yeah.
The scene itself as a whole has been drafts, but that one specific piece had not been in there until either the last or the second to last draft, and I had because and I worked on it for 4 years, and it was like in its 8th draft or something, and it was a very last minute like scale of time addition, and it was something that I both figured it would add, but I also kind of wanted to pay tribute to those people in the real world who are having this family as the people that are guiding them spiritually, and they had given me so much unknowingly by posting about things online and providing text and information and how they felt, and it just felt like the right tribute to give back.
Yes, that was beautiful. I'm so glad you included it. I love how you embrace queer identity in this book. Like when Loki assumes female form and female identity and shows up with Sigyn, and the conversations that they have around gender and sexuality and Loki's gender fluidity, it was so validating and so beautiful. And also with their son as well, with Valley, and his partner and his queerness, and how Sigyn has that conversation with Valley about the dangers of showing up in the world, but the safety and security that she can provide for him within the context of their home environment. And I don't know, that just really made me, I loved that so much, because that validation of showing up as a queer person and having that family support and that encouragement, I mean, it was such a beautiful thing, and is really, very, very, very needed right now, especially, I would say. So I really appreciated all of that you wound into the book. As a Loki worshiper, that scene really hit home. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And I have to wonder, like going back to what you were saying about so much of it being written down post-Christianity, like Loki as a devil figure, like how different would it have been for Norse people practicing that religion, and what would Loki have showed up as, and how would his status as a god have maybe been different pre-Christianity, right? Like, because he's very much like vilified, right? But in that context, it could have been potentially quite different as well. So at the end, Goddess of Nothing at All, definitely not so much of a happy ending. It's Ragnarok, right? So I mean, we kind of know where everything is heading towards. That's not so much of a spoiler. I mean, it is that it's in the book, but and then I loved Epilogues for Lost Gods. Such a beautiful book. I absolutely, and it was such a beautiful follow-up. And of course, I read Goddess of Nothing at All within 24 hours, and then I immediately jumped into the next book, and I was so excited that it was there, because had I not had the follow-up right away, I would have had the worst book hangover ever. It's such an engaging read. So what was it like writing Epilogues for Lost Gods as the follow-up to the original book, and like how was that process different? Because I know Goddess of Nothing at All was your first book. So what was it like approaching the second book? And I'm also curious to know, like, do you go into it with a specific outline? Do you write what comes to you? Like, what's your writing process like? That's kind of separate, but yeah, I'd love to know.
So the first book was, I said, like around a 4-year thing from kind of accident starting to actually having it published. Whereas now I have a better foundation under me, and as well I understand technical that have nothing to do with writing. So it's easier for me to, in a year and a half, kind of put a book out the door. And that's usually my timeline. Like I'll start partway through the year, and then within a year and a half, hope to have it out. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But with Epilogues for Lost Gods, I knew that I wanted to deal with grief and like all of these things that had come out of the first book and be able to kind of work through them in a way that didn't feel hopeless. Especially The Goddess of Nothing at All came out in 2021, and it was really thinking like, yeah, I need something that is inspiring hope rather than just dark.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that book would be really helpful for anyone that is navigating a grief process, because you really weave in what that experience is like, right? The guilt and the grief and navigating all of that and learning to trust someone again after betrayal and all of that. And I think a lot of people, and it ends a lot better in terms of like, there's a much happier conclusion. And I know that there's probably people that would say, oh, well, Loki is such a shit. They don't deserve a happy ending. But I was so satisfied by how things resolved, because both Sigyn and Loki, I think, perceive themselves as somewhat flawed and broken, and to see two people that experience life in that way and have gone through so much trauma find each other and find love and acceptance and happiness and joy was so satisfying, even more so because it was so hard won, right? Like, and it was just so beautiful to, I mean, I kind of read both books almost as if there was one big book, right? Because I read them so close together, and it was such a satisfying arc between the two of them. And yeah, it was so fantastic. And yeah, and Sigyn's relationship with Alyssa, and I love that you have positive polygamy representation in the book and multiple ways to have relationships and to engage with other people. I mean, it's so beautiful to see that represented in such a lovely way in books. Yeah, so what were the biggest challenges when it came to writing these stories for over the course of the two books? And what was the part that you found kind of you approached with the most ease?
There are characters that kind of like Loki that already kind of have a cultural expectation of personality, and we kind of know them already. And then there were a whole bunch of characters that I had to come up with a personality, because in the source material we don't hear them speak. Some barely exist. Some of them I've made up, and having to kind of build a where all the characters feel fully fleshed out, while some of them are like existed better from the start. It was hard to kind of balance that out and bring some of those other characters to a to feel as real as the others already feel to us. It also is difficult sometimes to take where they don't have a timeline. There are certain stories that clearly happened before other stories, but I had to create a narrative for them over the span of, I mean, I don't know how long we're supposed to consider the start of Norse mythology to the end of Norse mythology. Is that supposed to be 50 years, 10,000 years? Like, it's hard to kind of conceptualize that and then put it all in order when we were never meant to tell the stories in order in the first place. So that was extremely difficult. But then there are certain stories where Thor's hammer isn't there yet, so you know that it happens before that, or certain he's got his hammer, so you know it has to happen after that. And then as far as ease, the easiest thing in the book was Lucky, because that was the character that I come in to write, and the one that I felt just kind of existed off the page anyways, and it was more joy than pain to write him.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. So then you also have The Threads of Fate, which is a collection of short stories that involves all of the characters that you wrote about in The Goddess of Nothing at All and Epilogues for Lost Gods. So What was the process of writing those stories? Like, I think there was a couple that had already been written and were added to the anthology, and then there was others that were written specifically for it. So, yeah, what was that process like of revisiting the characters and fleshing out some of the stories? Was there one in particular that you felt like you like absolutely had to write and explain to your audience? Or
There
articulate maybe
are
not.
there are in there that kind of were things that I wanted to explore for myself. Some of them were things that I had noticed that different readers had wanted to know more about a particular character, so I would write that origin story and or try to.
Yeah.
And so in some senses I was following what I needed to see, and then other senses like it was because I'm indie and I can do whatever I want, I can write those short stories from where people are lacking kind of a little extra information that doesn't show up in the book. Eden's story about being in the tower after having been kidnapped was something that I wrote out of spite. Is people were having a hard time with the concept. They wanted Sigyn to forgive or to be forgiven for the thing that happens in the book, and I was like, it's not that easy, and it just kept being a recurring theme. So spitefully, I put pen to paper and was like, this is why forgiveness isn't simple for them, and I haven't had a complaint in a while. Maybe that's why.
Well, I appreciate that relationships are complicated and things get muddy when it's not cut and dry, right? Like it's not so easy to forgive when you've experienced trauma like that at the hands of someone else or because of someone else. And Sigyn's way of making reparations in the second book I thought was so beautiful because it's not about her, it's about what's best for her friend, right? And I think that that's really beautiful, and I appreciate how you wrote that and how you wove that in. And so a lot of the backstories that were included in the short story collection just really helped augment and add to the original stories that you had written in such a beautiful way, and I really appreciated that you had put so much care into crafting that. It was really, really amazing. So let's talk a little bit about This Too Shall Burn, which is coming out later this month, which is so exciting, with Arden and Verity, and it's such a fantastic read. So what was your inspiration for This Too Shall Burn?
I had originally had like a blip of a concept that I wanted to explore, which was based around some conversation happening in the book community at the time, where people were talking about like they wanted to see female characters that were like evil, and that was just what they did, and unapologetically. And it kind of evolved away from that, ironically. But I knew that I wanted to have this kind of witch character who owned who she was and was confident and did what she needed to do to get by. And I think has more or less stayed the same. She's not overtly evil in the way she used to be. And the more I tried to kind of explore that, I felt like for the longest time there was something missing in the concept of the book. I originally had her starring across from a male character who was a villager, and some of the plot was the same, but all of a sudden I'd been researching for the book, trying to figure out like historical basis for witchcraft and medical practitioners and where those things aligned, and how those things are more or less the same thing and demonized by people who don't want women practicing medicine. So I was reading a couple books, and it just dawned on me that the villager should not be male, the villager should be female and should be dealing with menstrual health issues. And then that was the moment where the whole book kind of clicked together, and I was able to have Arden in that healing role, just trauma, and then also have something that was important to me for Verity to be exploring, especially the parallel of like having a problem that you're not allowed to talk about, and how nobody really agree to help you, which is something that modern day people with a uterus are often dealing with, either out of shame or out of lack of care.
Yeah,
And so
absolutely.
it just became this very angry book. Whoops.
But in such a wonderful way, like I felt very seen as someone who's been challenged by menstrual health issues for years, especially in the throes of perimenopause, where, I go and talk to my doctor and he tells me it's all in my head, and yet I'm dealing with things that are very real and impacting my day-to-day life. Like the way that you wove that in was very, very helpful. And I think, women's bodies, especially women's uteruses and menstrual health issues or reproductive health issues are something that even in our modern day society, it's still very taboo and it's still not talked about. And if you bring up menstruation or tampons or bleeding, like a lot of men will still freak out. And it's something that, you're not supposed to talk about. So the fact that there was that dialogue in the book and that acknowledgement of these experiences being real and being valid. And I think, traditionally, I think a lot of the women that were stigmatized and burned for witchcraft were healers and midwives and people that were caring for the community and were scapegoated in a lot of ways because they were perceived as having too much power, too much independence, too much freedom. Because if you're not conforming with society and the rigid structures of expectation, like I remember reading The Witch of Blackbird Pond when I was my girl's age, like 14, 15, maybe slightly younger. And we have it on audiobook, and I read it for them. And I was thinking about that book as I was reading yours and that whole idea of healing and women's traditional medicine and relationships with one another. And, I love that there's a doctor who comes and, helps the women with labor and delivery, and yet it's the midwife who shows up and actually gives care, and that was so powerful to me to see those relationships. And I think also the figures of power and authority and how that shows up in the book and how it's challenged. I mean, yeah, it was just such a beautiful study of all of those things and the idea of community and support and integration and everything. I loved it so much. I don't want to say much more than that because I don't want to give any spoilers, given that it's very soon to be released. But yeah, I really appreciated that that was heavily centered in the book. And yeah. So what kind of research did you do on witchcraft and those kinds of practices as you were approaching the book?
I was a little bit lucky in the sense that my previous books had given me kind of stand on of I had already somewhat been researching witchcraft and like different cultures of magic, the Norse myth books, and so there was already that. And then I was trying very specifically to look for a bit of modern practice, but like most things, if we remove like 500-600 years from the equation, we're not thinking about the way. So I was looking at a lot of very practical practices of witchcraft, of work with herbs, Greek witch type of practices, things that were less about intention and more about hands-on and knowledge and working in the woods and things like that. I'm describing it what I feel is a little awkwardly. But I wanted things that were very tangible, that had kind of, I could easily be like, there is a basis for this historically as well, because we know that people were using these types of healing methods, while trying to find different sources that were witch adjacent in the specifically in the healing field, that we don't have an attribution to them being specifically. This is what women were doing back in the day to keep their communities alive. One of the most difficult books to read is Unwell Women, because it had that kind of crossover at the start, where it is essentially talking about women and medicine for the last 600 years in the West. And that the little bits of overlap were shocking but not surprising. That makes sense. Disappointed but not even mad about it. I expected the whole time. So I'm still building up a foundation of kind of more modern witchcraft practices, because I'm not as it was less relevant to the book itself.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that really stood out for me was this practice of forcing women to leave the home because they were perceived as unclean. So like the whole process of having to sleep in the barn or an alternate space in the middle of a cold winter. And so where did that idea come from? Was that an actual practice that you came across in your research, or was that something that, yeah, well, I thought it was probably very true to a lot of people's experience. And again, comes back to that whole idea of like female bodies being unclean at certain times of the month. I mean, it's so ironic to me, given that women are responsible for the birth of a whole new generation, and that's part and parcel with that process, and yet it's seen as disgusting and can't go near it and all, you know, like, yeah. So I was just wondering where that idea or concept came from.
There are several cultures that I came across that kind of have that mentality of being unclean, but it was Christianity that I found that had this practice of putting people outside of the home. There is a fictional novel called The Red Tent, and it is like fictional, but based on plenty of real things, where they would send there was a tent, and any women who were menstruating had to be in that tent, and they would hang out there for a week at a time, and that was that. And so, unfortunately, it's not that concept when we consider that we actually, it's stuck firmly in our history, and we kind of now, because we refuse to talk about menstruation, and we keep it in an ideological box instead of a tent in the backyard.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you look at the lack of concessions for people in job situations where, you know, if you are having a really bad day with your cycle, you're just expected to power through, right? And there's no concessions for menstruating people to be able to take the time that they need to rest and recover, you know, because it can be really, really brutal. And there was a video floating around that showed men at the Calgary Stampede, and they put like a belt on, and they were given the experience of what menstrual cramps are like. And, you know, you get these tough, like, macho cowboy types who are coming in and are just absolutely doubled over. And that's what a lot of women experience on a regular monthly basis. And yet there's so little consideration for that, and it's so often dismissed as though it's nothing. And it's very much not nothing. And I really appreciate how much that was the focus of this book, because it's something that I think everyone should have a better understanding of, right? Because, I mean, at least more than half of the population, I would argue, is navigating this, at least half. And so, you know, I think it's important for women to see and see them, or, well, menstruating people to see and see themselves identify, but it's also important for people that aren't menstruating to see what that experience is really like, right? And I feel like you really brought that to the fore in your book, which I appreciated. Yeah, I've heard of The Red Tent. I haven't read it as of yet. Same with Unwell Women. But I'm glad that there's more of the history that is actually being written about and talked about, whether it's in fiction or history, right? Like, I think there's whole chapters of, it was fascinating. I did an online walking tour of Amherst, where they were talking about a lot of the old historic homes during the pandemic, and I was watching it with the kids, and they were talking about all the captains of industry and these really privileged, rich white men who were owning all of the homes. And there was no reference to any of their wives or the women in their lives. Like, their names are just gone in history, right? And there was someone who was involved in the call who was asking about working class history, because this is also very much upper class history, these people that could afford these big homes. And the person holding the meeting basically made reference to some people who they were aware that they had staged a protest or a strike of some sort, because there's a lot of industry in town, but that was the only reference point to somebody who didn't fit this very narrow, you know. And I often think about how many people are just erased from history because they're not powerful white men, right? Like, so it's, yeah, it definitely is something that deserves a lot more focus. So, and you're currently working on another book that is due out next year, I believe. Coal Gets in Your Veins, and that has a vampire theme, if I understand properly, with Jean and Spencer, I think, are the character names. So are you feeling comfortable talking about that at all, or would you rather leave that for later?
No, I mean, it is still very much being first drafted. There are things that are going to really change between now and then. But the concept is essentially, there's a lot of discussion in book spaces about writing what you know and staying in your lane and things like that. And I had kind of thought to myself, what is a book that I would write look like if I am staying in experiences that I've had, and how do I take that and make it like something that anybody would remotely want to read? In a coal mining town where there was like 2 stores, and I never left because we didn't have a car, and it's a very impoverished area. And so it took a long time for me to kind of come up with an idea, and it's not that I had to do it, but it was more of a challenge to myself. What would I do if I had to do this? And now I have this story that is it is more or less a woman in a bad relationship who is she's grown up in this area, she's never and she is on the cusp of really needing a change, and she feels that she hasn't been given a lot of, she just has gone from milestone to milestone to milestone and kind of ridden the road and without choosing much for herself. It makes no logical sense, but I really enjoy vampires. So we have a kind of hermit vampire who's hiding from his own past, who is living there unbeknownst to anybody, and they kind of run into each other. They form a of like desperation and loneliness, and the story is equal parts talking about areas and how coal mining is a very traumatic history for an area to have, and how it changes the way that people operate down the line for generations. And then also a story of kind of change and coming into your own and making connections with other people while kind of having to navigate leaving behind. It is still very much in the works, but that is more or less, there's going to be kind of horror elements, paranormal elements, little bit of spice, because why not? And it's one of those things that a lot for me, but hoping that somebody else will also enjoy it.
Oh my goodness. Everything you just said has me so excited about it. I mean, my vampire loving self of like 14, 15, 16, all the way into my 20s, if I'm being honest, still to this day. I'm just so intrigued by vampire lore and all of that, and juxtaposing that on Nova Scotia coal mining history and small town, and it sounds utterly fabulous, and I'm so excited. I can't wait to read it. And what a wonderful way to write what you know and yet add something to spice it up just a little bit that allows you to, explore different things. So what kinds of things do you focus on when you're looking at research for a book? And this one in particular with like vampires and things that are outside of your lived experience but still relevant to the story. Like, what's your go-to reference for mythology around this, or information? Like,
pretty much
questions
anywhere. A lot of the time, I'll either be reading books, listening to audiobooks, historical nonfiction stuff, or I will watch documentaries, I will listen to podcasts, like whatever I find and suits the intake that I'm. Sometimes the research is me playing a game that is vampire-based, or watching movies that are vampire, not necessarily to get facts, but more to kind of just absorb what's out there and see what sticks. One of the ways that I have really loved engaging with it is going to movies and seeing what they are also saying, because there are certain things in the last, especially like 5 years, that we're coming to understandings of like where movies came from and what is not really productive to keep. One of the things that I'm spending time looking at this time is there is a lot of vampire mythology and Jewish culture, and not in positive ways. So there are certain things like cabals that we want to process out over time while still keeping our fun vampire stuff.
Yeah.
So trying to make sure that I'm informed what is not productive to keep before I put something out in the world is something that's important for me to keep an eye on.
Absolutely. And I love that you're focusing on that too, because there's a lot of things to do with mythology and culture and intersections that can be problematic as well. I'm sure that you found that in a lot of different areas with your research. So, you know, really focusing on what's useful for you and not offensive and all of this, like that's awesome. Yeah, we're doing well for time. I just wanted to ask a little bit more about the Kickstarter too, because I know you just shared an audio clip from the narrator for the audiobook, and it was so good, super spicy, so lovely. And what was that process like? Like when you're putting together an audiobook, and I know you have the Kickstarter for it, which I'm so excited about. Do you get to choose the person that reads for you? Or are you given a selection of readers? Like I know you just had a sample sent in. So what's that process like of putting your book baby into audio form?
It is different depending on kind of where you're coming from, because I am publishing my own work through different channels and I'm not going through a traditional publishing house. I get a lot of say in what's going on. I kind of wait to do this for a very long time. It's a significant financial investment, so I had been putting it off. And so essentially you choose a website that you want to work through. You check out the samples and things that are on there to see if there's someone you would like to invite to audition. Alternatively, you put it up and you say, I can pay this much per finished hour of audio. Crack at this book, and then you invite people to audition. I had invited for auditions, and I wasn't hopeful that I was going to get somebody who, for the amount that I can contribute, who was going to be able to do something amazing with this book, because I have very high standards for audiobooks. I know what I like in one because I spend my days listening to them, and I don't want to do it not to be the quality that I would listen to. So I had some auditions that I wasn't thrilled by, and I was kind of waiting it out. I had put it up on the web anyways. I was just feeling brave. And then someone came along who had seen my book before online, knew what the book was, had been hoping to someday do that book. And she is the person that I ended up going with. It took 24 hours to decide that this is the one. She has excellent narration. She does an incredible Loki voice. She understands Sigyn as a character and knows where to kind of make her sound like the kind of person who's going through struggles on the one side, but will also tell somebody off convincingly on the other side. So she sent in, it was 5 or 6 different scenes that I had up, and she sent the scenes back, and I was just floored. And we have she sent a sample yesterday, and it was a 30 minutes. It was a full chapter from the book that had like a bunch of characters listen to it, and minimal notes to send back. As soon as she responds to my notes, the whole book goes into production, and I'm excited. I think I'm going to be a puddle on the floor when I listen to that whole book, because it's a dream come true having somebody do this.
That is incredible. How amazing. I'm so excited about your Kickstarter, and you just hit the 50% point as well for funding within like the first day or two, which is incredible. I mean, I'm just so excited about this audiobook because it's so fabulous to read, but to have someone narrate it as well is extra special. And the clip that you shared was so good. Like, so good. Like, I immediately, it just fits so well with how I had been, like, envisioning the audio in my head, if that makes sense. Like, it just fit really nicely. Yeah, that was beautiful. So before we run out of time, I have everyone who has entered the giveaway for your 4-book collection, which was so generous. Thank you so much. I have it all in a rotating wheel, a click to spin. So I was just going to do that before our chat is done so we can let the person who has won know. So here we go. Ooh, so exciting. And it is at Laureen.gfr who has won. So congratulations, and I will reach out to them as soon as this is done to let them know that, and we can coordinate an email address and get that sent over. So yay, that's exciting.
Excellent.
I'm going to make a note. So is there anything that you would like people to know about your books in general, or the series in particular, or your upcoming publications? Yeah.
I have the Kickstarter that we've been talking about for the audiobook. It's running now until the end of September. This New Show Burn releases on September 13th, so there's still time to pre-order that.
Yes.
We also have pretty much all 4 books pair really well with comfort food and tissues, so that's your warning going into. And I have a newsletter, an Instagram, TikTok. You can find me on most except Facebook under the handle that I've been doing here, so Cat_Rector.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, because I think your newsletter just came out at the beginning of September. It was a great read. I'm looking forward to keeping up with you on that in that capacity as well. That's fantastic. Oh, yes. Well, for anyone who hasn't read Kat's fabulous books, do yourself a favor, go grab a copy. They're absolutely riveting reads. This is definitely one of The Goddess of Nothing at All. That whole Unwritten Runes series is one of my top reads for this year. So fantastic. Yeah, I highly recommend. And the short story collection that corresponds with it is absolutely fabulous also. And thank you so much, Kat, for joining me for this. It was an absolute pleasure chatting with you about your books. It's so lovely.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, it was wonderful. So thank you so much. And I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
You too.
Take care, and thanks again.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.